Welcome to our special convocation this morning. This is hosted by the Westminster Student Association, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you both of our speakers. Dr. VanDrunen, he is our Robert B. Strimple Professor of Systematic Theology and Christian Ethics. If you want additional reading for the topics that we'll be covering today, will be Natural Law and Two Kingdoms, Living in God's Two Kingdoms, a Biblical Vision for Christianity and Culture, as well as essays entitled Calvin, Kuyper, and Christian Culture for the book Always Reformed, Essays in Honor of Dr. W. Robert Godfrey. And he has written on Kuyper and other forums as well. And then Dr. Godfrey, our President and Professor of Church History. He has several online recordings concerning these topics in church history and various lectures with Ligonier, Greenville Seminary, and others. He has written a couple of articles for Outlook and Modern Reformation as well. You can find these topics in those resources. After both have given their views, they'll both present a 15-minute lecture presenting their views, and then after that we'll have a dialogue, and then after that we'll have a short time for question and answers. So please welcome Dr. VanDrunen concerning the Two Kingdom and Kuyper dialogue.
Well, thank you. Good to see you here. I hope I sound okay. I'm fighting off a little pesky cold, and I don't sound exactly right to myself, but as long as I sound all right to you, that's all that matters. Let me begin by suggesting one very basic thought that I think would be very crucial for what I'd want to communicate today. Since we're talking about the Two Kingdoms in Kuyper, at least that's the assignment that we've been given to talk about, I would say don't pit the Two Kingdoms versus Kuyper, as if Kuyper and the Two Kingdoms are these two great alternatives for considering Christianity and culture issues, as if these are sort of the two main Reformed views or something. I would suggest instead that Kuyper was a part of a broader Reformed tradition of speaking about two kingdoms, of working with categories that, whether explicitly or implicitly, were of a two kingdoms nature. I would say that Kuyper is one contributor to a broader Reformed consideration of the idea of God's twofold reign. I think that he was in many ways a helpful contributor to this tradition, although I think there were also some ways in which he was not as helpful, and I think we would do best not to lionize Kuyper or treat him as a demigod, but as one of a multitude of important Reformed theologians who addressed these issues of Christianity and culture, and in fact who did so from a basic Two Kingdoms perspective. If you're looking for an alternative way to consider Christianity and culture from a Reformed perspective, I will suggest one at the end of my opening lecture. So let me begin then by saying a few things about what I understand the Reformed Two Kingdoms paradigm to represent. Now, not all early Reformed theologians or churches explicitly or even implicitly embraced a two kingdoms kind of model, but you do see it in Calvin and in the so-called Genevan model, and it became quite common, even standard, in many continental Reformed theologians and churches, and certainly among the Scottish Presbyterians. The basic idea I would describe as this: that God is the ruler of all things, and he rules all things through his Son. And he rules through his Son in two distinct ways. On the one hand, we have a rule of God in Christ that is rooted in his work of creation and the ongoing providential sustaining of this world, in which God establishes this world, the order of this world, has established basic social, cultural institutions of this world for the benefit of all people and all creation. Secondly, that God in his Son has instituted a redemptive rule through specifically Christ, the incarnate mediator, who has come to earn salvation for a people of his own, and through which he establishes his church, ultimately to bring his people to an everlasting new creation. Calvin called the two kingdoms the civil kingdom and the spiritual kingdom. Many later Reformed theologians used the categories of the kingdom of power and the kingdom of grace. I myself have chosen, I prefer using the terms common kingdom and redemptive kingdom. But these different terms are meant to get at some of the same basic ideas. So I would have you note several important aspects of this very basic two kingdoms idea. One, both kingdoms are God's. It's not as if one kingdom belongs to God and the other one belongs to Satan or sinful man or something. Both kingdoms are God's. Secondly, neither kingdom is morally neutral or autonomous. Since they are both God's kingdoms, they are both under his authority and under his moral law. And third, Christians are citizens of both kingdoms. Christians live under and benefit from both God's preservative rule and his redemptive rule. Now, I'd also want to say that this basic two kingdoms paradigm is just that. It's a basic paradigm. It doesn't automatically translate into a detailed public policy. It leaves a lot of room for argument and disagreement about how it gets worked out in our political, legal, economic, and broader cultural lives. So, for example, the early Reformed theologians upheld a two kingdoms view and also believed that the civil magistrate had a role in punishing blasphemy and heresy. And some of them believed that magistrates had a role in calling church synods. Now, I find this application unconvincing and even inconsistent, but I think it's worth noting that the two kingdoms itself doesn't mean any kind of detailed public policy. But why I find this paradigm theologically correct and quite helpful for thinking about our life in the broader world, I would say that when it comes down to it, the thing that I appreciate the most, perhaps, is that it helps us to understand our participation in the broader institutions and activities in this world as both, on the one hand, legitimate, and on the other hand, penultimate. Or to put it perhaps another way, it allows us to understand our participation in the broader, broader cultural activities and institutions of this world as, on the one hand, God ordained, and on the other hand, provisional. And it seems to me that both of those are very important. That God has actually instituted the broader organizations and institutions of this world, and yet they have a penultimate and a provisional character. So let me turn to Kuyper. Now, I'm not aware of Kuyper speaking specifically about the Reformed Two Kingdoms paradigm. It wasn't something that he either directly embraced or directly imposed. But I think that his work belongs to this broader tradition or the broader paradigm that I have just described. Now, let me say, just on a personal note, I used to not think that. When I first started doing some serious work on this issue, and particularly when I started doing some serious reading in Kuyper, I had it in my head that Kuyperian was something different from a Two Kingdoms model. And I started reading Kuyper with that bias in my head. I mean, it's understandable because I think that was just the way that it was sort of assumed. And for quite a while, I struggled trying to read Kuyper in that way. And it came to me in the course of a lot of reading and wrestling that I was thinking of things in the wrong way, that Kuyper actually belongs to this broader tradition. You might think that maybe I really wanted, that was the conclusion I wanted to have, and I just tried to find it. I totally did not expect to come to that conclusion, but I did. I think particularly important here is Kuyper's distinction between Christ as mediator of creation and Christ as mediator of redemption. I think that is very similar to the older Reformed distinction between this twofold kingship of Christ. The kingship over creation, a natural, a universal rule, and his redemptive or mediatorial rule, particularly over the church. Secondly, I think Kuyper's distinction between common grace and special grace has some important correspondence to earlier Reformed thinking about the two kingdoms, the civil or common kingdom on the one hand and the spiritual or redemptive kingdom on the other hand. And I'd also want to say that this interpretation of Kuyper that I have offered, and I offer this in several places, but especially in a chapter in my book, Natural Law and the Two Kingdoms, that this interpretation is not unique to me. This is not something I just made up. Even though I really came to it through my own reading, I did discover a number of other scholars who take a very similar reading of Kuyper. And I would mention John Bolt, Jeremy Begbie, Dutch philosopher S.U. Zuidema, Jacob Klapwijk, John Helsley Wood. Some of them don't like this aspect of Kuyper. They think it's too dualistic. But it's interesting that even some people who want to be fans of Kuyper find this in Kuyper, perhaps as a good thing or perhaps as a bad thing. Now, I think there are several ways in which Kuyper makes helpful contributions to a broader Reformed two-kingdom paradigm. I'll just mention these briefly. One, I think that his development of the doctrine of common grace is a helpful complement to Reformed two kingdoms thinking. The common grace idea has been controversial in Reformed circles, to be sure. And I don't agree with everything Kuyper said about it, but I think on the whole, his work on common grace is a very helpful complement to this tradition. Secondly, I would say that his grounding the idea of common grace in the Noahic covenant is very helpful. Now that Kuyper's big book on common grace is being translated, you could look at the very first volume and find he begins his discussion of common grace by talking about the Noahic covenant. And he says it's not a redemptive covenant, but he says that the starting point for the doctrine of common grace lies in God's establishment of a covenant with Noah after the flood. This is a big deal for me. I think this is absolutely right. I think Kuyper's very helpful on this point. I also think Kuyper was helpful in supporting the denationalization of the church and also supporting a generous measure of religious freedom in broader society. He supported the revision of Article 36 of the Belgic Confession to reflect this. I think that was very helpful. I also think his idea about sphere sovereignty is on the whole rather helpful. I think it helped to focus the Reformed tradition, the Two Kingdoms tradition, away from simply on the state and towards other institutions of civil society. Now, at the same time, I think there are things about Kuyper that we need to think critically about. And I'll just mention these very briefly, and if you're not familiar with Kuyper's work, it might not make a whole lot of sense, but I do want to say them, and maybe we can talk about these later. I find some of his language about the Christianization of society or of a nation to be confusing. I think his emphasis upon Christianity as a worldview is problematic in certain ways. That needs to be considered critically. There are some oddities in his ecclesiology, particularly the way that he argues for the organic church as more fundamental than the institutional church. I have doubts about the pillarization of Dutch society that Kuyper's work promoted. I also have some problems with some of his over-the-top political rhetoric. You know that Kuyper ran a political party I know it's very hard for Americans, at this moment in history to believe that political rhetoric could ever get over the top or out of hand. But I'm afraid that Kuyper engaged in some of that in ways that were not helpful. And finally, I would say that if you haven't read James Bratt's biography of Kuyper, which just came out a couple of years ago, I'd encourage you to do that. That's a very interesting book. It's a good read. And one thing I'd say is that Kuyper doesn't always come out as the most pleasant person. I think that's fair to say. But I mean, Dr. Godfrey isn't the most pleasant person always, and we all love him, so it's not necessarily meant as a criticism. But he was a genius, and geniuses are not always the easiest people to work with. And maybe a reason to remember that Kuyper was human and needs to be treated as such. Well, I would conclude here. I think my 15 minutes are coming to an end. And I would say that if you really want an alternative to the two kingdoms idea, you're not going to find it in Kuyper. Kuyper's part of that broader tradition. I would say that the real alternative lies in what I would call contemporary neo-Calvinism. And I have, in a lot of my writings, I have suggested books like Albert Walter's Creation Regained or Cornelius Plantinga's Engaging God's World as examples of this contemporary neo-Calvinism. And I don't single those out in any disrespectful way. I think those are, in many ways, very, very good books that set out that paradigm in a very compelling and engaging way. But they, maybe we can talk about this later, set up what I think is a quite explicitly one kingdom way of viewing the world. And speaking of all activities and institutions as belonging to the one kingdom, making all of work kingdom work, and promoting the redemptive transformation of all of life. With that, I will close and hand things off to Dr. Godfrey.
Thank you, David, for an excellent beginning. Thanks to the Student Association for arranging this profitable time. I have modest goals. My hope is to lionize Abraham Kuyper and transform David VanDrunen. I come because this is an important topic. And I come as a historian, reflecting on it as historians do, trying to look at the distance and movement of ideas and how they're shaped. And I come as an interested student, not as an expert like Dr. VanDrunen. So I hope I know my place, which is in part to provide comic relief. In that interest, I would like to say I am the real David here, not Professor VanDrunen. He's the Goliath. This is an important scholarly topic. It deals with really fundamental issues of Christ and culture, and Christ and the church. And so we are touching at some of the most basic elements of Reformed social thought. And Dr. VanDrunen has done us all a great service in the work that he has done in reflecting on these things and looking at the history of them, as well as trying to look at them systematically and historically and biblically. And we are in his debt. I want to look at this also, I think, pastorally, because many of you here are preparing to be pastors. Some of you here are pastors. And the consequences of this debate have had not only scholarly ramifications that are important, but they've had pastoral ramifications. And they've had pastoral ramifications in part because there has been a good deal of misunderstanding out there about what Two Kingdoms is all about. I think Dr. VanDrunen's beginning was very helpful because so many people out there on either side of the divide want to set two kingdoms against Kuyper or Neo-Kuyperianism. And often that is done with a great deal of passion, sometimes with a measure of vitriol, and often with very little knowledge or learning. My son was in a car with somebody who was vehemently opposing Two Kingdoms, and my son asked, have you actually read anything on Two Kingdoms? And the answer was no, he hadn't, but he knew it was completely wrong. And this is not a good position for seminaries or pastors to take, but it is the reality that pastors may confront And so it's very important for us to realize there's a lot of emotion out there about this issue, and we need to try to be well-informed and thoughtful as we approach these issues to recognize that if we're going to be pastorally helpful, we need to be able to calm down the rhetoric, provide clear information, as Dr. VanDrunen did today, and to recognize, as he at least alluded to in his remarks, that the fears of anti-two-kingdom people, usually without any real foundation, are that somehow religious neutrality and autonomy are being promoted, that the vocation of Christians outside the institutional church is being denigrated, that the efforts to build Christian institutions, particularly Christian schools, is being undermined, and that Christians are being invited, in effect, to withdraw from cultural engagement. Now, I think all or almost all of those things are untrue of a two kingdoms approach, but pastorally, those are the things we need to be sensitive to and be able to respond to and talk about. Now, I think part of the vitriol that's been directed at Professor VanDrunen and others who have stood with him is a result that in many Christian schools and Christian colleges in this country, a kind of neo-Kuyperianism has been the dominant self-explanation and self-rationalization. And so there's been a kind of complacent neo-Kuyperianism out there that has not faced within Reformed circles a lot of criticism or analysis, and so there's been a kind of sharp reaction, as entrenched interests always react sharply when they're in danger. That's my historian's observation. Now, what I hope we can spend a little time doing is looking at where are real differences. If there are all sorts of fears that are illegitimate, where are there real differences between Dr. VanDrunen's vision of two kingdoms, which he's already admitted is not the universal Reformed vision of two kingdoms. It is indeed a very broad descriptive category. It's a label that has limited usefulness in a sense. It's not without any use, but just as the label Reformed or the label Protestant has some usefulness but doesn't become very specific, so the label Two Kingdoms is a somewhat useful label, but not very specific. If John Calvin is two kingdoms and believes that heretics ought to be executed by the state, that means that the Two Kingdoms label is pretty broad to cover that point of view and Dr. VanDrunen, to cover that point of view and Abraham Kuyper, for that matter. So it's a label that we need to recognize is a very broad label, and under that very broad label, Dr. VanDrunen has some rather specific points that he wants to make that I think are particularly useful for us to talk about and reflect on today. And as I've tried to think about that, it seems to me that there are two critical points that I think Dr. VanDrunen stresses in a very sharp way. One might be tempted to say that he's been too antithetical on. I thought that was a clever remark, but apparently not. He's drawn a very sharp contrast between the creational and the redemptive. He's drawn a very sharp contrast between the common grace realm, the cultural realm, if you will, on the one hand, and the special grace realm of the institutional church on the other hand. And certainly it is useful to draw that distinction, but if one draws that distinction in such a way that the two are almost separated rather than distinguished, we may be drawing too sharp a distinction and allowing too little relationship between those two realms. And so that's one thing that I hope we'll have a chance to talk about. And I think closely related to that conviction of Dr. VanDrunen is his assertion that nothing of human cultural accomplishment in the common realm will be taken over into the new heaven and the new earth. That cultural products in no way will be useful, used by God in the establishment of the new heaven and the new earth. Now that point is useful in underscoring this, I think, radical distinction that he draws between the common realm and the special grace realm. But I think it's overstated, and I think it's not perhaps entirely biblical or ultimately helpful. Now, maybe I haven't understood him correctly, and I'm eager to talk about these things, but he himself quotes a statement by Abraham Kuyper that I found particularly helpful. It's always easy. It's easier to read people who quote Kuyper than read Kuyper himself, because there's a lot of Kuyper, and so any help in reducing the amount of labor is a good thing. But Dr. VanDrunen quotes Kuyper to say this: "The institute of the church does not cover everything that is Christian. Through the lamp of the Christian religion only burns within that institute's walls. Its light shines out through its windows to areas far beyond, illuminating all the sectors and associations that appear across the wide range of human life and activity. Justice, law, the home and family, business, vocation, public opinion, literature, art and science, and so much more are all illuminated by that light." And it seems to me that that's true. It seems to me that that's almost self-evident, although I may be revealing myself as a complacent neo-Kuyperian by saying that. It seems to me the light of the Christian religion, the special grace of Christianity, does shine into every area of life in such a way that makes a difference. Now, I don't have any trouble with saying the language of redemption is not helpful there. That to say we are going to redeem politics may not be really helpful. But I think to say the light of the gospel ought to change politics as Christians have influence in politics is not too much to say. Now, maybe Professor VanDrunen would agree with some or most of that, but I want to press a little harder on his sharp distinction between the institutional church as the realm of special grace and everything else as the realm of common grace. And I want to press that particularly relative to the family. It seems to me this may be the institution of society where we can most clearly see whether we want to make a sharp and complete distinction between the realm of common grace and the realm of special grace. The family is part of the common kingdom, the civil kingdom, however you want to label it in Professor VanDrunen's analysis. And what that means is that in the first place, and here of course we agree, that the family is an institution that Christians and non-Christians in certain ways share in common. You don't have to be a Christian to have a family. That being said, however, we have to ask, is the family then a common institution in sort of every way? It seems to me that the Bible says no, it is not a common institution in every way. If it were a common institution in every way, how could Paul talk about the children of Christian families as holy? Children, it seems to me, must be seen on a two kingdoms approach, as Dr. VanDrunen expresses it, as a cultural product of a common grace institution. And cultural products of common grace institutions are never taken over into the new heaven and the new earth. But if that's true, isn't the new heaven and the new earth empty? What populates the new heaven and the new earth? To be sure, the elect, to be sure, the redeemed, but the redeemed are those who are born into families. And the redeemed who are born into families are called by the apostle holy. In fact, even the unredeemed born into Christian families are called holy by the apostle in 1 Corinthians 7:14. So it seems to me that when one looks at the scripture, these lines between the common and the special, which are helpful to a point, are not as radically separated as Professor VanDrunen seems to do. We might look at other areas to think about that. What about the Sabbath? The Sabbath is a creation ordinance. The Westminster Confession of Faith says it is binding on all people. And yet the Sabbath is clearly also a redemptive institution. If it's a creation institution and a redemptive institution, must the protological and the eschatological be kept so radically and constantly distinct? I think it'd be also useful, if we had enough time, which we probably won't have, to talk about Kuyper's idea of the organic church. I think it is an interesting idea, and I understand it can be a problematic idea. I don't think Kuyper intended by it, although ideas have unintended consequences. I don't think Kuyper intended to reduce the importance, the centrality, the value of the institutional church, and I certainly agree with Dr. VanDrunen in his labors to highlight and emphasize and praise the central importance of the institutional church. But it seems to me Kuyper is on to something when he says, isn't there more to the church when we see it being described in the Bible than what is contained simply in the institution of the church or even in the idea of the invisible church as the reality of all the elect? For example, and I hesitate to quote Ephesians with Professor Baugh here, who now knows everything about Ephesians. And, but when Paul says in the end of chapter 1 of Ephesians that the church is the body of Christ, the fullness of him who fills all in all, it seems to me a little difficult to confine that statement either to the institutional church or to the invisible church. That's the kind of thing I think Kuyper was saying is that light that shines out. It shines most brightly in the institutional church, but it also shines wherever Christians are present and active. And another issue we might talk about, although I'm sure I'm out of time, but thankfully I didn't really look at the clock when I started. Another issue that we would want to talk about is there a danger in many kinds of two kingdoms theologies of seeing Christian activity outside of the institutional church simply in individualistic terms? One of Kuyper's great contributions, it seems to me, is as he saw the medieval world coming to an end, a world of struggle between the institution of the state and the institution of the church, to say that in the New World, that Kuyper was confronting the dangers of tyranny would be the tyranny of the state on the one hand, where he spoke prophetically of what seemed to have happened later in the Soviet Union, or the danger of the tyranny of the individual, which seems to be the situation in which we find ourselves today in the United States. And what Kuyper tries to do with his fierce sovereignty is to say, it's not just state or individual, but God in his wisdom has established any number of institutions, each with their own internal structures and authority, and each with their own individual responsibilities ultimately to God alone. And that's why the family is not simply a common institution, but the family under God is an institution both common and among Christians holy. And I think that's very important. Well, these are questions I've raised. I hope I haven't understood Professor VanDrunen, misunderstood him too badly, and I'm eager to see what we can discuss about this. So thank you for your kind attention. Again.
All right, so I guess I'm talking now.
You may.
I probably shouldn't try to respond to everything that you said you'd like to talk about.
No, we can do this again.
That doesn't sound like much fun, but let's see. You know, okay, I tried to highlight a few things that I got the impression that you thought would be useful to talk about, and I can at least start, and maybe you want to interrupt at some point before I get through all of them. I guess I think when you began to identify two critical points, you referred to the sharp contrast between creation and common grace, and on the other hand, special grace, redemptive realm. And then you would refer to things like later on radically separated and things like that. Maybe just to make a brief comment on that generally, I don't think at least if I haven't for a really long time, used language like, let's keep these radically separate, or what else? Sharply contrasted, or whatever that is. I have found that as I've interacted with some people over the years, that they seem to impute a sharpness or a radicalness to it that I'm not necessarily trying to say. I guess the way I would want to put it, generally speaking, is that I would want to see these two kingdoms, or common grace, special grace, or Noahic covenant, covenant of grace, as distinguished but not separate, in a way that it may be analogous to the way that we talk about Christ's two natures as distinguished but not separate, or justification and sanctification as distinguished but not separate. If we don't properly make the distinction, or even if we start blurring the distinction, we're going to run into some theological problems. But they are meant to be held together, and I would say these two kingdoms or two covenants, it's part of the one plan of the one triune God. And so I guess I would say I'm not really consciously trying to create a radical separation or contrast. And if that's the impression that I give you, then, well, I mean, that's worth talking about. But I guess that's one thing that I would want to say just
Could I just read this quotation from your book on living in the two kingdoms? You say, a kingdom now advancing through the ministry and life of the church, and one day to be revealed in consummate glory, apart from any work of our own human culture. So that sounds like a pretty radical contrast to me. Not necessarily a separation, but I guess, what I'd like us to talk about is how that works out in the family and how we understand the family. If the family is part of our own human culture, if it's part of common grace, then how can Paul call children of Christians holy?
Yeah. I guess, if you want to focus on the family for now, I think focus on the family. I guess I would. Yeah, and you said this up front, and I think this is a place to start, is that the family is, it's grounded in God's creating work. It's reaffirmed in God's common grace in the Noahic covenant, and marriage and family is just as legitimate in those terms for the unbeliever as it is for the believer. My unbelieving neighbor is no more or no less married than I am because I'm a believer. And I think that the basic responsibilities of the family are also common, in the sense of the mutual support of husband and wife, the procreating and the raising of children to be the next generation of those populating the earth. Those are common responsibilities that believers and unbelievers have. Mm-hmm. Of course, we expect believers to understand those better, but it's not a unique responsibility for believers. Now, here's where I would say, I wonder if some of, maybe you're forcing a kind of sharp distinction that I would not myself want to advocate on this, is I would say that if we're thinking about the church and the work of the redemptive kingdom, that the church is constantly using and embracing aspects of common human life for its purposes. The church doesn't have its own language, for example. I mean, we here speak English, and the church throughout the world speaks the prevailing language of its communities. We don't develop our own musical styles. We don't develop our own architectural styles. We borrow things from our prevailing cultures. And we think that's all right. And we may have to think critically, obviously, about these things, but we do that. And I wonder if something analogous is like that with the family, is that we recognize that the family is absolutely fundamental for all human life. It's fundamental for all other human institutions. That's true for the state. It's also true for the church. And I think without a doubt, the Scripture presents Christians with special responsibilities to marry in the faith, to raise children in ways that are consistent with the faith, and to pass that along. And that we as the church recognize that when believers participate in families and have children, that those children are to be regarded as part of the covenant community and baptized and educated accordingly. I guess what I would ask is, does that make the family something other than a common institution?
Yes, I think it does.
Well, I guess I would say...
I think the Christian family is more than a common institution. It's not less than a common institution, but it's more than a common institution.
Yeah, I guess I'd be comfortable with that if you just define that in certain ways. I would not want to take the so-called Christian family and somehow remove that from its participation in the common realm. I think it's proper that we recognize that the marriage between Christians it's recognized as the same sort of institution as the marriage among unbelievers for purposes of civil society. But I wouldn't argue that there are some special responsibilities, certainly, that go to family of Christians.
You know, I really am not trying to press this to just be obnoxious. I'm really curious how you think about this. If children are the cultural product of the family, I mean, that may not be the happiest way of putting it, and therefore a common product, how can they ever be described as holy when only the institutional church and its redemptive activity is holy?
Well, I guess what I'm inclined to say, top of my head, is that the reason they're holy is not, it's not strictly speaking the family. The reason that they're holy is because they participate in the covenant, and we regard them as members of the church. That we don't separate, it's not as if we just look at the family itself, it's that as, by virtue of being the children of Christian parents, or even one Christian parent, those children are members of the Church of Jesus Christ, and they're baptized as members of the Church of Jesus Christ.
But they're part of the Church of Jesus Christ because of their participation in the Christian family. It's the family that connects them to the church, not their present faith, not their present regeneration, not even their baptism, because most Reformed people have argued that they are to be baptized because they're holy. So it's purely that they are a product of a Christian family, that they are holy. And therefore, it seems to me the family at that moment participates in a redemptive holiness that it seems to me you're saying, when you overstate it some, can't be true, because it's a common product that has nothing to do with the special grace of God.
I think you're putting some words in my mouth when you say it has nothing to do with it, because I don't say it has nothing to do with it. I mean, I think there's all sorts of ways in which common institutions have things to do with the church.
Are there all sorts of ways common institutions are holy?
No, I would not say that.
But then I come back, then how can it be that the children of a common institution are holy?
Because God has ordained that Christians of believing parents are members of the church and ought to be baptized. It seems to me that if anyone's making the separation, it's you right now. I mean, I would say that we can only understand the holiness of children, of believing parents, in their membership in the church, in their connection with the church. And so it's because they are part of these families, they're children of believing parents, but they're still only baptized insofar as they are members of the Church of Jesus Christ. It's the church that baptizes. It's not the Father that baptizes.
Absolutely.
And so it seems like I guess I'm not sure what you're driving at quite exactly at the moment, or where? I mean, what's the bigger point?
My proposition is a very simple one. The family is a common institution. They produce common cultural product, namely children, and therefore, it seems to me, in the logic of your system, those children should never be called as members of the family holy, because they're common. But in fact, Paul calls them holy, which leads me to think, this is why I'm drawn to Kuyper, because I think sphere sovereignty really is a position of multiple kingdoms. So while I think you and I would agree that we're not pursuing a Christian state, I am pursuing Christian families, because I think state and family are not part of a single kingdom, but they are distinct institutions, I would say distinct kingdoms, under the reign of Christ with the distinct responsibilities and distinct teleologies, in a sense. So the new heaven and new earth are going to be full of people who got their beginning as cultural products of a common institution. Now, they only get to heaven by special grace, but they are products of a common cultural institution, and therefore are taken over into the new heaven and the new earth.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that, I don't know, again, it seems that you're arguing with something a little different from what I've argued. I mean, when I've argued that cultural products are not taken over into the new creation, maybe I can clarify that, and this may be getting a little far afield from the family issue, but maybe it's time we talk about some other things as well. I would say that what I've tried to argue, and I think I could have been more clear than what I say in Living in God's Two Kingdoms. I tried to clarify it in class. Is that Scripture only promises the direct continuity of one particular thing between this current creation and the new creation, and that is ourselves. That is the resurrection of our bodies. Right? That I do think that there is. I don't think it's going to be a creation ex nihilo. I think this present world is going to be consummated in the new creation. But I would say there's no promise of any particular thing in this world other than ourselves as being taken over. There's no promise that the non-polluted river is going to be made new, or that a particular work of art or a particular work of music or a beautiful table or a beautiful glass is going to make its way into the new creation. In a way, I'm kind of agnostic. I'm not saying absolutely it can't, but I'm just saying we don't have any promise of that. Now, I think it's curious that now, that's not to say that what we do here and now in our broader common life is not relevant for who we are and what kind of people we're going to be in the new creation. Obviously, we're shaped in countless ways, not only by the families we live in, but by the sort of work that we do and the sort of political communities we live in and the sort of artistic life that we engage in. And certainly those things are going to shape us and will continue to have shaped us when we're in the new creation. And certainly God takes account of all that we do. And on the last day, we have to give an account for the things that we've done in all different areas of life. So my comments have been aimed at the sort of cultural product sort of thing, the things that we create, not having promise of those things being with us, over against some particular arguments from certain neo-Calvinists. So I'm just not sure how that argument relates to the point that you were making earlier, that we're going to be in heaven as, you know, a product of a family. That's true. That's part of my family. Is part of what defines me. Although at the same time, I recognize that we're not, you know, marriages end at death, and there's no more marrying or being given marriage in the new creation. So we're not going to be living in families the way we live in families now in the new creation.
No, I think
there's an important point of discontinuity there.
I think that's true. I think there are points of discontinuity, but my point is that I think there are also points of continuity. I don't think I'm overstating some of the ways in which you have drawn a sharp contrast I do think it's helpful, as a historian, to be reminded that your dialogue partner in some of these sharp contrasts is particularly Neo-Kuyperianism, where I think you're absolutely right, that when they talk about, environmental ecology redeeming the natural world, that's not a helpful way of speaking. And I think you're right that even Kuyper at times could use that language. But I think at the same time, while it's useful to distinguish the common from the special, I think there is a danger of separating them too sharply. And I would say that especially to seminary students. I've heard some of you with difficult social questions saying, well, two kingdoms solves that. Two kingdoms as a slogan doesn't solve anything. It doesn't even communicate anything. And we have to be very careful about that. It does seem to me when we think about the political realm, for example, I was trying to think of examples, and we're quickly running out of time. I think in the West, Christianity at times, unfortunately not all the time, but at times has been a light in the political realm against slavery, for example. I don't think you can argue that any text of Scripture outlaws slavery absolutely. But I think when Christians have thought about what it means to be a light in the world, and when Christians have thought about what it means to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, it began to dawn on them that slavery is not an institution anybody would want done unto them. And therefore,
I know the Student Association probably wants us to stop and have questions, but you've been asking me a lot of questions. I want to just ask you, it's not necessarily asking you, but maybe clarifying and you can respond, but you quoted Kuyper. You actually borrowed from me, so I was doing your dirty work for you and
I appreciate
digesting
it.
Kuyper
I gave you
for
credit. I gave you credit.
I know. That's good. I appreciate that. And about Christianity illuminating all areas of life, however that quote went. And I guess here's something that I have, and I feel like I've tried to make helpful distinctions. And here's a place where I'd want to make I think we make some helpful distinctions. Do I think that Christianity, Christian truth, Christian faith, should it have a positive impact, say, on the political realm, to use your example? And I'd say, yes. There are all sorts of ways that it should make us more responsible participants in that area of life, without a doubt. And that the light of special revelation should help us carry out those responsibilities better. But here's a point that I would want to emphasize is, does the advent of Christianity, does the death and resurrection of Christ, does it fundamentally change what civil government is supposed to do in this world? And I would say no. And I think actually Kuyper would say no as well. In that Romans 13 looks really similar to the Noahic covenant, for example, that governments have always and continue to be responsible for doing justice, for punishing the wrongdoer, praising the good. Now, of course, that needs lots of working out. But I would say that basic function of civil government is not something that's fundamentally changed by Christianity. It doesn't, and that's why I say it shouldn't be redeemed. Christians are responsible, and hopefully we can be better at this, although it'd be nice to see more evidence that this was actually the case. Christians theoretically ought to be better at promoting justice within civil government. But civil government remains a creation common grace, I think especially a common grace ordinance from God. And so that's why I think that where I've tried to make some distinctions here, I think we can affirm, yes, we want to be a light in wherever we are, but it doesn't mean that we're fundamentally changing the nature of the institutions themselves, or that the institutions remain something other than penultimate or provisional.
Except the family. But we'll come back. I agree with you, and I appreciated your point that certainly Christians, as they get involved in politics, need to be very wary of not claiming they have the Christian point of view on some political point where the Scripture is not spoken explicitly. I think that's very valid, and I think Kuyper, at his best moments, would have agreed with you on that. I think the interesting question then to move on to is, if we are not able, in the fallen condition in which we find ourselves, to found the Christian political party, which would bring the Christian perspective on politics to bear, as Herman Dooyeweerd tried to write about in The Christian Idea of the State. Is it legitimate for us to organize a Christian political party to try to bring to bear the best insight a group of Christians have at this moment in history on politics, hopefully with a measure of humility, saying we're not the Christian political party, but we are trying to think about politics from a Christian point of view? Is that a legitimate exercise?
Well, I mean, I don't have an absolute answer to that. I mean, I think that's one of those points you can debate within a broader framework. But and of course, this gets into some of the issues of the pillarization in Dutch society.
And I share with you some of the concerns about
concerns. I guess I would say, look, I think it's great if Christians want to get together and talk about, okay, how can we participate in political events and take views on political issues in ways that are consistent with our Christian conviction. I think that's great. And if that's part of what you were getting at when you're concerned about is sort of an individualization of Christian activity, then I think that's a good point, a legitimate concern. I guess part of I'm not crazy about the idea of Christian political parties. I think it's very hard in the American system, very hard, to make it. It makes more sense in a kind of a parliamentary system that Kuyper was working under. But I guess I would say that I'm concerned that even though I think it's good for Christians to talk with other Christians about what this ought to look like, how we can be faithful, I think that we also have a responsibility, not just a possibility, but we have a responsibility to be working alongside unbelievers in these other areas of life. And I'm concerned that we don't just talk to other believers, that our political activity is not just getting together with people who already think like us for the most part and hashing out details, but I think it's very important that we, as difficult as it is, that we actually have to be talking with unbelievers and thinking about how we form political alliances on certain issues, even when we might disagree, and fundamentally in other issues. And of course, Kuyper had to do the same kind of thing in his own particular way. So I question the wisdom of the Christian political party. I think there are other ways to accomplish the goal of trying to have Christians think together about appropriate Christian political involvement. Do we need to end this?
I think the professors that are teaching in the next hour really aren't doing anything important. We could just carry on.
It does include me.
Oh, sorry. Well, maybe somewhat important.
I'm actually lecturing Kuyper next hour.